Thanks for everyone's patience while we work through that. So here's the agenda for tonight. I'm going to go through some introductions of the Findett Corp site team and Superfund management. And then I'm going to turn it over to Susan Fisher, and she's going to kind of give a general overview of Superfund and how it relates to the site. And then the project managers will come up and give background information and kind of an overview of all 4 operable units. And then, like Carrie said, we'll move into a question and answer session for about 40 minutes and then break at 7:30 to move into a CAG working session. So for some introductions, our division director, the Superfund and Emergency Management Division Director, is Bob Juergens. And then we have Tabitha TJ Atkins. She's our remedial branch manager. She's here this evening. And now the PowerPoint presentation. Okay, there we go. And then for other members of the site team, we have Susan Fisher, the section supervisor. JP Curry, he's here tonight. He's the remedial project manager for OUs 1 and 3. Kathy Cicchini, she's the site attorney for the Findett Corp site. And then myself, and I handle the community involvement for the Findett Corp site. Oh, and Tanya, her picture wasn't on there because she's here tonight. Yes, thank you. All right, perfect. And now I'll turn it over to Susan Fisher to get started on going over Superfund.
I want to make sure I have this right. So I just go down here.
Why don't you worry about the presentation and all?
Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming tonight. As just said, my name is Susan Fisher. I'm section supervisor in the Superfund section. And I want to talk just a little bit about what is Superfund. For those of you that don't know, Superfund is actually, I can't read my screen, sorry. The Comprehensive Environmental Response. Thank you. Can I move this? I'm so sorry. I got you. Okay. And Liability Act, which is CERCLA, was started in 1980. And that was as a result of Love Canal. If anybody's familiar with Love Canal, which is a toxic dump site from the 1970s, the CERCLA Act came into the Superfund. The CERCLA Act came from 1970 Love Canal and other toxic substance waste dump sites. And Superfund is informally what we call CERCLA. So kind of when we say CERCLA and Superfund, it's one and the same. And this allows EPA to do cleanup actions on hazardous waste sites. Oh, do that. Okay, thank you. Okay, so in Superfund, we have 2 separate entities. We have the removal section and remedial section. Removal does emergency response actions for hazardous waste cleanups. They come in and they do fast cleanups. Usually it's under 2 years. They're dealing more with soil remediation, soil removal, cleanups, emergency responses, things like that. Then on the other side, we have a remedial. Remedial's long-term actions. That's more of, you'll see remedial has more groundwater sites, and their sites go for many, many years. How do you do that? Sorry for the technical. So the Superfund removal process, this is just a little overview of what they do in the removal process. They do an assessment, then they go ahead and do the removal, and then post-removal actions. And sometimes Superfund sites that go through removal then get pushed over to the remedial side, and remedial takes it and cleans up the groundwater and does a long-term action on those sites. Thank you. Then we have the remedial process. And as I said, it is it's very long-term, and as you can see, there's a lot of steps in the remedial process. It starts out with a site investigation. It goes through a feasibility study, which kind of helps determine what remedial action is going to be done at the site, a record of decision, a remedial design, and a remedial action. So there's quite a few steps in the remedial process. And I just hit right here. The Superfund has cleanup standards, and they're called maximum contaminant levels, or MCLs. You will hear MCLs acronym a lot. And basically, MCLs is what EPA uses as cleanup standards for groundwater. MCLs must be met at the point of consumption, which basically for this site, as when it comes to when the water goes out to the tap that you drink, it must meet MCLs. This is just a diagram. This is not the city of St. Charles, but it is a diagram of what a water treatment plant might look like, just to kind of give you an idea. There's monitoring wells and what we call piezometers. Those wells are out in the area of a groundwater plume that is contaminated, and they help tell us where the contamination is and how high the contaminant levels are throughout the plume. Then we have wellheads that actually pump water into the water treatment plant, and that's the water that you drink. And so from the wellhead, we have what's called an influent. That's the influent to the water treatment plant. It goes through the treatment process and comes out the effluent, which is the finished water. When it comes out the effluent, that's where we look at MCLs for the drinking water standards. And I'm going to turn over the part of the presentation to James Curry, who is one of the remedial project managers.
Hello, everyone. I'm James Curry. I'm JP Curry, or also go by JP Curry. I was assigned project manager for Findett OUs 1, 2, and 3 back in September. As Susan said, I'll be giving you some background information on OUs 1, 2, and 3. But first, before we get into that, I'd like to discuss what a groundwater plume is and what we mean when we talk about a groundwater plume. A plume is simply a column of contamination with measurable horizontal and vertical dimensions that can be suspended in and or move with groundwater flow. As you can see in the picture shown here, contamination that occurs at the ground surface can seep into the subsurface and impact groundwater, resulting in a plume of contamination. We measure the vertical and horizontal extents of the contaminant plume with monitoring wells or piezometers. Piezometers are also a type of monitoring well, so they're kind of one and the same. Under natural conditions, a typical contaminant plume will travel with groundwater flow toward a point of discharge. Depending on the contaminants and subsurface, contaminant plume can move at various depths and velocities below the ground surface. For instance, as some of you have probably seen, gasoline will typically float on top of water. Contaminants at this site, like DCE and dichloroethylene DCE, will typically sink lower in the water column. Although groundwater has a natural flow direction, the movement of groundwater and contaminant plumes can be influenced by such things as drought, flooding, and pumping of wells. Go ahead. So a quick breakdown of the site, as you can see here, operable unit 1, which an operable unit is how Superfund breaks down sites, complex sites with multiple issues into simple, easier to understand and pieces and parts to better organize response actions. They can be, they're simply divided into operable units based on site complexity. Like I said, each one may address a geographic area, specific problems and issues. Potentially, it could be divided by separate or potentially responsible parties, or PRPs. It's another acronym. Are areas where specific action is required. Common examples of an operable unit at Superfund sites are construction and operation of a groundwater extraction and treatment system, or construction of a cap over a landfill. In the case of this site, OU1 consists of surface contaminated soil as well as shallow contaminated groundwater within and below the former Findett and Cadmus property boundaries shown on the slide here, which are highlighted in yellow. So you can see the property boundaries in yellow. Potentially responsible parties conducted soil excavation at OU1, as well as initial construction and operation of a groundwater extraction and treatment system. Currently, EPA is the lead agent. There's a lead on conducting response actions at this operable unit. Operable Unit 2 was addressed by responsible parties, potentially responsible parties who conducted excavation of polychlorinated biophenols, PCBs, PCB contaminated surface soils in 2001 is when they conducted an excavation at OU2. OU3 addresses groundwater contamination with volatile organic compounds that migrated off of OU1 and OU2 property boundaries. Response actions at Operable Unit 3 are conducted by a group of multiple companies identified as potentially responsible for contamination. They are referred to as the OU3 group, they conduct work and response actions at OU3 with oversight by the EPA. OU4, which is not pictured on this slide, is the contamination associated with the Ameren Houston Road substation, located approximately a half-mile northeast of OU1. Response actions at Operable Unit 4 are conducted by Ameren and overseen by the EPA. Tanya will provide an update on OU4 later in the presentation. Seen here is a general site timeline dating back to the site discovery in 1976. As you can see, the site has a long history with a lot of activity through the years. You can see that the timeline stretches back a long way with the site and that numerous response actions have taken place at the site throughout the years. What's important to note is that it's common for groundwater sites to take a long time to become fully characterized and achieve cleanup goals, as numerous factors can affect groundwater conditions. These factors could include weather, climate, seasonal temperature and pressure changes, subsurface geology, pumping of wells, river stages, and much more. We'll be getting into a lot of these dates later in the presentation, and this timeline is available if you would like to take a closer look at it in the community involvement plan on the EPA site profile page. The QR code for the site profile page and community involvement plan will be shared at the end of the presentation. It's also shared on the slide on the handouts today. In the last few slides, touched on what a groundwater plume is, provided a breakdown of the site's operable units, and presented a general timeline of site history. Going forward, I'll provide background information on operable units 1, 2, and 3, starting now with operable unit 1, as you can see. Operable unit 1 at this site encompasses contaminated groundwater at the former Findett Corp site, as well as contaminated soils around an area referred to as a quench pond, which I'll get into what that is on the next slide. The Findett Corporation property boundary, again highlighted here in yellow, was addressed by EPA. It was first addressed by EPA after Findett self-reported its handling of fluids containing polychlorinated biophenols, PCBs. PCBs were banned from being manufactured in the U.S. in 1979, but were commonly found in oils used for motors and hydraulic systems, thermal insulation materials such as fiberglass and foam, adhesives and tapes, oil-based paint, and other similar products. Day-to-day operations at Findett Corporation primarily focused on the recycling of industrial oils used in motors and hydraulic systems and heat transfer or thermal insulation material. Irresponsible common industrial practices at the time Findett Corporation was operating led to releases of various hazardous substances, including PCBs and volatile organic compounds. The primary contaminants of concern, or COCs, as we call them at the site, for the site are PCBs, dichloroethylene, DCE, and vinyl chloride, as these have the lowest cleanup standards. The entire list of contaminants of concern at OU1 can be found on the EPA site profile page in the 2005 5-year review. In the Superfund program, COCs, or contaminants of concern, are the drivers of cleanup actions at the site and are evaluated in a feasibility study, which is feasibility studies, basically where we determine like treatment technologies, best treatment technologies, and how to approach cleanup, how to potentially approach cleanup. The site is currently abandoned with access restricted to EPA and EPA affiliated contractors who conduct routine checkup and maintenance of the groundwater extraction and treatment system. As I mentioned in the previous slide, Findett Corporation dumped waste fluids of their manufacturing process in what is referred to as a quench pond. This quench pond is highlighted here in red on the photograph shown. You can kind of see the quench pond, it's like a dark circle. Dumping of waste fluids led to in this pond led to PCB and VOC contamination of the soil in this area. Originally, the EPA in the 1988 Record of Decision outlined excavation and offsite disposal of the surface soil in this area. However, with EPA approval, the potentially responsible parties conducted studies to evaluate if biological treatment of the soils could break down PCBs. The Record of Decision was amended in 1995 to include biological treatment of PCBs in the soils, again highlighted in the red area. The amendment did not identify the need for any changes to the groundwater extraction and treatment system to address the VOC contamination. Between August 1999 to October 2001, the potentially responsible parties attempted biological treatment at this quench pond area. However, difficulties with maintaining the biological treatment system resulted in the potentially responsible parties, or PRPs, requesting to excavate contaminated soils. In 2003, the PRPs conducted the soil excavation to a maximum depth of 5 feet below ground surface into the 25 parts per million PCB cleanup level identified in the 1995 Record of Decision amendment. And parts per million is just a unit of measure commonly used to report very small amounts of contamination. For context, 1 part per million is equivalent to 1 milligram in a kilogram, or 1 drop of water per 1 million drops of water. The remedy at OU1 also includes the use of a groundwater extraction and treatment system to treat VOCs. Once groundwater is pumped out of the ground, it is treated by an air stripper system. The image on the left shows the old air stripper unit that was installed by the potentially responsible parties in around 1991. The image in the center is a more modern air stripper unit that replaced the old air stripper unit in 2022. Air stripping is a common response action at Superfund sites throughout the country for groundwater contamination with volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, in which groundwater is pumped from extraction wells and sprayed into a treatment tower, as you can see on this right picture here. It's sprayed through the top, and then you have air pumped in through the bottom, and the air kind of comes into contact with the water, and it strips and causes the VOCs to evaporate. Water that passes through the treatment tower is sampled on a regular basis to confirm the effectiveness of the treatment system and ensure compliance with MCLs. In the case of OU1, the water is treated on site. The water that is treated on site is discharged to the sewer, where it will end up in the municipal wastewater treatment plant. Shown here is the general site location on the left image. In monitoring well locations for OU1 in the center image, and monitoring well locations for OU3 are in blue on the right image. You can see the site's proximity to the city wells, as well as the endpoint drinking water treatment plant on this left image here. The closest city wells to OUs 1 and 2 are City Well 4 and City Well 8, which are approximately a half mile away. The yellow lines on the center image show the property boundaries of Findett and Cadmus. In total, there are 18 monitoring well locations for OU1 and 19 monitoring well locations for OU3. This slide shows a general timeline of response actions at OU1. This operable unit is currently in a long-term operation and maintenance phase. We have included 5-year reviews in the timeline, as these are statutory requirements at Superfund sites that have a remedy in place. The purpose of 5-year reviews is to evaluate the protectiveness of the remedy and identify issues and recommendations to ensure the long-term protectiveness of the remedy. 5-year reviews can identify small things as well, such as security issues, and they can also up to enhancement of the remedy itself. At this site, the remedy for OU1 will be evaluated in the upcoming 5-year review that's due in 2025, and the next 5-year review due in 2025 will start. We'll start working on that this summer. Some site background on Operable Unit 2, 1973, the two founders of Findett Corporation agreed to separate properties and operations, which led to the formation of Cadmus, also referred to as OU2 here. Prior to 1973, Cadmus did not exist and Findett owned both properties. The Cadmus business was based on one recycling process. OU2 addresses the PCB contaminated soils on the former Cadmus property. The 1988 investigation conducted by EPA identified PCB contaminated soils up to 6,000 parts per million. As a reminder, parts per million is a unit of measure, and 1 part per million is equivalent to 1 milligram per kilogram, or 1 drop of water in 1 million drops of water. In 1995, EPA completed a full evaluation of Operable Unit 2, which resulted in excavation of PCB contaminated soils to a maximum depth of 5 feet in 2001 by a group of potentially responsible parties. The image on the right here shows the excavation area. In gray is to a maximum depth of 5 feet, and then I believe the hash marks show a maximum depth of 3 feet because there was a sewer line they had to take into consideration. Operable Unit 3 addresses contaminated groundwater that migrated off the OU1 and OU2 property boundaries. EPA selected monitored natural attenuation as the OU3 remedy in the 2005 record of decision. M&A, it's important to note that M&A or monitored natural attenuation cannot be implemented at all sites, as it depends on the groundwater and subsurface conditions. EPA does not consider M&A to be a walkaway approach. Certain parameters must be shown to exist within the subsurface that allow for breakdown of contaminants. Data must also routinely be collected to show that these parameters are still there and that they remain, and that this breakdown is occurring. The OU3 group submits M&A evaluation reports every 5 years to show that conditions for M&A are still present and that breakdown of contaminants are still occurring. The next M&A evaluation report is due this summer as we start the 5-year review. However, because MCLs have not been achieved yet, we will be evaluating the OU3 remedy in the next 5-year review coming up in 2025. The contaminants of concern for OU3 are volatile organic compounds, benzene, vinyl chloride, dichloroethylene, DCE, and chloroethane. Presented here is a general timeline of response actions that have occurred at OU3. As mentioned previously, 5-year reviews are used to evaluate the protectiveness of the remedy and identify issues and recommendations, both large and small. The remedy for OU3 will also be evaluated in the upcoming 2025 5-year review in conjunction with OU1. Future response actions at Operable Units 1 and 3 include, as I've mentioned before, the next 5-year review will be evaluating the futures of OU1 and 3. Within the next couple of months, we're also planning to do some limited site investigation work around OU1 to verify historical sampling data. And now I'm going to turn it over to Tanya to discuss OU4.
Hey everyone, so my name is Tanya Howell and I am the remedial project manager for OU4. I've been working on this site for almost 2 years now. So JP has come on after me. So we're somewhat new in the life of the remedial project. As was mentioned earlier, some of these sites take decades to get cleaned up. For those of you who are at the meeting we did last February, some of what I go through is going to be repetitive from that meeting, but it is going to be briefer so that we can get to some of the updates that have happened over the past year. So OU4 addresses soil and groundwater contaminated by VOCs or volatile organic compounds at and around the Ameren-Houston Road substation. Contamination was first detected at City Well 5, located approximately 200 feet north of the substation in the summer of 2010. The OU3 group investigated around the substation between 2011 and 2015 to determine if the contamination in City Well 5 was part of the OU3 plume. And for those, City Well 5 is that blue dot right in the middle. Samples were taken at multiple depths at 84 different locations represented by the small black dots on this map. The orange shading indicates where contaminants were found in the groundwater. In other words, where the contaminant plume was located at that time. As you can see, there are several black dots on both the east and west sides of the identified plume that are outside of the orange area. These dots outside of the orange shading indicate sample locations where contaminants were not detected. You'll also see black dots all the way around the substation. No contaminants were detected to the east, west, or south of the substation at that time. It was also determined at that point in time that the majority of contaminants were moving with the groundwater at approximately 45 feet below the surface. The results of the OU3 group's investigation identified that the contamination detected in City Well 5 was from a separate and distinct source of contamination originating from the Ameren-Houston Road substation. As part of the substation's historical operations, Ameren used chlorinated solvents or volatile organic compounds as metal degreasers. This included a product which contained 18% PCE or tetrachloroethylene. This figure illustrates the treatments that Ameren conducted outside of the substation between 2014 and 2018 under the EPA's oversight. The green circles toward the bottom of the figure are where the sodium prosulfate injections occurred, and the green circles that you see in horizontal lines are where the zero valent iron injections or barriers were put in place. Water flowing northward toward the river, as well as the majority of the city's drinking water wells, is treated as it passes through these injection points. These injections were placed throughout the contaminant plume as defined and shown in the previous slide. You may be asking, how do these injections work? When chemical compounds called reducing agents, such as zero valent iron, are added to the contaminated soil and groundwater, a chemical reaction occurs that changes contaminants into other forms, sometimes referred to as daughter products or breakdown products. In this case, the zero valent iron, as well as the sodium prosulfate, help to break tetrachloroethylene or PCE and trichloroethylene or TCE down into dichloroethylene, then vinyl chloride, and finally ethene. However, keep in mind that groundwater has to flow through these barriers in order for it to be treated. As mentioned in the previous slide, this slide demonstrates that chemical reaction that I just mentioned that occurs when you break down the PCE, the tetrachloroethylene, into eventually ethene. PCE, which was used historically at the substation as a degreaser, as well as the TCE, the first daughter product of PCE, has already been broken down and is only seen at the site in small concentrations. Most of what we are seeing at this point is the DCE and the vinyl chloride. The decreases of PCE and TCE and the increases in DCE and vinyl chloride are expected in part of the remediation breakdown. The end of the reaction chain, which is the ethene, does not have any health concerns associated with it. This figure shows where monitoring wells are located within the previously identified plume area. The monitoring wells are shown by all the little yellow dots, which I'm sure you can't see numbers on, but all those yellow dots are monitoring wells. On the left side, the green shaded area is where the vinyl chloride plume was located in 2014, before the treatment studies were conducted. On the right side, after the groundwater treatments, you can see that in early 2021, the vinyl chloride plume was no longer moving through the area that had been treated. You can see here's places where it was at. Quarterly groundwater monitoring has been conducted at monitoring wells since 2014 to evaluate any changes in site conditions. Again, you can see the locations of the monitoring wells by the yellow dots in this figure. In December of 2021, a monitoring well designated as piezometer 11, which is toward the top of this particular figure, had a detection of dichloroethylene and vinyl chloride for the first time. None of the other monitoring wells in yellow had any changes really to the data that was being detected there. And again, you can see piezometer 11 is the one that you see the blues and greens that are circling it up to the top of this figure. The EPA conducted sampling around piezometer 11 and City Well 6, which is located next to piezometer 11 or near piezometer 11, to help determine the source of this contamination. The EPA's sampling, along with the routine sampling of the existing monitoring wells by Ameren, indicated that the injections were effective where they were applied in 2014 to 2018. However, the sampling indicated that the contamination was still from the Houston Road substation and that the contaminant plume had shifted to the east of the previous plume boundaries. For those looking at this particular figure, the green dots represent sample locations that were non-detect for vinyl chloride. The yellow dots represent detections below the MCL, and the red dots represent detections that were above the MCL. You'll see that, especially with the red dots, you'll see some that are larger. So the larger the dot, the higher the detection of vinyl chloride was. You can see from this figure that there were really no detections along the area where the barriers were put in place, which is represented by the two gray lines on this particular figure. Once it was established that the contamination from the Houston Road substation was from the Houston Road substation, the EPA directed Ameren to perform interim response actions under EPA's oversight. These response actions were conducted to quickly address contaminants leaving the substation while additional investigations were occurring and long-term cleanup alternatives were being evaluated under the focus feasibility study. This resulted in Ameren conducting several rounds of subsurface injections similar to what was conducted historically to treat the groundwater. These injections included sodium persulfate, sodium hydroxide, and bioaugmentation with inside the substation. This figure represents where those injections occurred. The sodium persulfate and sodium hydroxide injections are represented in green, and the bioaugmentation is represented by blue. For those who may be asking what is bioaugmentation, in this case, it includes injecting substances such as soybean oil, food additives, nutrients, carbon, Miracle-Gro, etc. And these substances help support bacteria growth, which is important to break down the site contaminants. And a lot of times it's even necessary for those types of injections to get, once you reach the DCE and vinyl chloride stage, in order to get it to break on down to ethene. A lot of times you need to do this bioaugmentation to help it break through on that process. In addition to the injections mentioned on the previous slide, over the past year, Ameren has installed multiple zero-valent iron barriers between the substation and the city's drinking water supply wells. These barriers are depicted on this figure by the blue lines. There are a total of 8 different walls made up of 161 individual injections. In total, these walls extend over 1,610 feet, and they are located approximately 30 to 65 feet below the ground surface, which is the depth at which the majority of the contaminants at this site are moving. Although a lot of the interim treatments have been taken over the past year, as some people know from your previous engagement with EPA, EPA's main task was for Ameren to complete a focus feasibility study. As demonstrated on this slide, a remedial investigation feasibility study was completed for OU4 in March of 2020. The EPA subsequently completed a record of decision in June of 2021, prior to the contamination being identified around piezometer 11 and city well 6, approximately 6 months later in December of 2021. The record of decision included the continued operation of the groundwater treatment system and additional bio-augmentation injections to continue that breakdown of dichloroethylene and vinyl chloride into ethene. The unexpected detections in December of 2021 in the area outside of the original plume boundary resulted in the EPA reopening the investigation to determine if changes needed to be made to the remedy and the record of decision prior to its implementation. Under the EPA's oversight, Ameren was directed to reevaluate the contamination and develop what is called a focused feasibility study. A focused feasibility study will evaluate long-term remedial alternatives. Basically, this study will require Ameren to look at multiple different ways or technologies to address the contamination, both at the substation and where the contaminants have already migrated off the subsurface property or substation property. Ameren will submit this report to EPA, and EPA will analyze whether or not any changes to the remedy in the 2021 record of decision or additional components to the remedy are needed. This timeline was provided to Ameren in a letter dated December 5th, 2023, and is available on the site profile page. It provides deadlines for deliverables associated with the completion of the focused feasibility study. It also lays out a general timeline for the completion of fieldwork that needs to be conducted under these plans. However, it's important to note that these dates may change due to circumstances such as extensive document reviews, weather, driller availability, etc. The finalization of the work plans to conduct the necessary fieldwork to complete the focused feasibility study are the next items on the timeline to be completed. They were scheduled for completion tomorrow. Although that deadline has not been met as of today, the EPA anticipates the finalization of these documents sometime next week. These two documents are the site characterization plan, which will further define the nature and extent of contamination, and the performance monitoring plan, which will provide additional data regarding any secondary impacts to groundwater chemistry from the interim measures that have occurred over the past year with all of the injections that have taken place. Assuming fieldwork can begin this month, the schedule that you see on your screen may change slightly, but is not currently anticipated to extend more than a week or two past what's currently there, which would be sometime mid to late June. Although at this point, the EPA has not developed a schedule past the finalization of the focused feasibility study, which again should be mid to late June, the next steps after Ameren submits the focused feasibility study would include EPA's analysis of that document, which could result in a change to the current remedy as described in the 2021 record of decision. If a change to the record of decision is needed, the EPA would produce what is called an explanation of significant differences, also known as an ESD or a ROD amendment. Both of these documents ultimately accomplish the same thing by documenting changes to the original remedy. The main difference is that a ROD amendment is used to document what the EPA would consider a fundamental change to the remedy, whereas an ESD is used to document what is considered a significant change to the remedy. So I'm going to turn this back over to Jess to have a few more items and then turn it over for Q&A.
Perfect. Yeah, just a couple items. JP, Tanya, and my contact information is up here. You can also find it on the Findett site profile page. And again, that QR code's on the handouts or on this next slide that's about to come up. I think it's me. Right, so now we'll move into the discussion, and if it's okay with the CAG, I will stand up here and kind of direct questions, you know, depending on what y'all ask to JP, Tanya, or TJ, or Susan, who the most appropriate person is. So we'll go ahead and start our question and answer session, and I think what Rouse told is all these microphones up here should pick up everyone in the room for the folks joining us online. And then I believe TJ also has a microphone if anyone needs it to project into the room. So we'll do this question and answer session until about 7:30, and then we'll move into CAG working session. If you don't get your question asked, or you think of something later this evening or in the next week, you can always contact me directly, and I can get with the site team and get y'all an answer. For those folks online, if you could type your questions into the chat, I'll be moderating that as well, and I can ask your question on your behalf in front of the rest of the audience here. So we'll just start with folks raising their hand, and if you want to stand up and ask your question, and we'll address them. Oh, yeah. Yeah, if it'll be easier for the folks with EPA to move to the front of it. Does anybody in the room have any questions? We'll start in the back with Monty.
Okay. Has EPA asked Harmon to come to the CAG meeting and be a member of the CAG?
I have not asked Amarin to come to the CAG meeting. This is our first public CAG meeting. I did not ask them to come out. I don't know if anyone else on the CAG has reached out to anyone at Amarin.
So typically EPA wouldn't ask them, it would, the CAG could reach out to Amarin and we could also help with that, but we wouldn't typically invite them for you.
I probably misstated the question. I don't mean EPA has Amarin been invited to be part of it. That should be the question.
That would be,
We have not invited them.
Well, following up to that, do you think it'd be a good idea to?
so they typically aren't a member of the CAG, but they certainly can sit in and just like the city and other entities are.
So my question is, do you think it would be a good idea to bring, this thing's been going on for 40 years.
May I answer that?
Huh? 44 years it's been going on. Of course. Good.
So, yes, they can come to the CAG. Yes, they're aware of it. No, they have not said anything to any of us unless they talk to any of the other CAG members. They know about the meetings. They're aware where we're doing the meetings, but no, they have not said anything at all.
So the difference though, the question is being invited or being aware. Were they invited? On the CAG side, facilitated by PRP are members of about half of them, the other half they are not. So I just wondered what the status was.
We'll follow up. We discussed it, and this is meeting 3. This is not meeting 30 for us.
Right.
We took the first 2 to kind of get our feet together and figure out who we were going to be and who was going to be in the group and who was co-chairing. But we did talk about should there be representation from Amarin, and EPA said maybe they will, maybe they won't participate. They were invited. I will say they were invited to the EPA's presentations last year and chose not to come.
To add to that, they have not shown up at any of the public events EPA has held at all. Not a representative, not anyone officially with them, ever.
I got that one.
I'm happy to reach out to you. So.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Next question. John, did you have your hand up?
Sure. First was a point of clarification on the slide, the OU4 site background. You had city well 4 labeled as inoperable. That's not true.
It's an older
Yeah.
figure, yes.
So if you could just make correction for future presentations, it'd be appreciated. I had a question on the plume being defined as the vertical and horizontal extents, like you were explaining, JP. What is the point where there is no plume and there is a plume? Is that going from 0 to 0.001, or is that going from non-detect to above an MCL? What defines the edges of a plume?
Can you pull that? The OU3 figure.
three figure. This one.
That's a good question.
JP, can you come up?
Oh, yes.
Sorry.
So typically, we bound plumes based on wells that have non-detects versus wells that have detections. So that answers your question. I'm sure how to try to think of the best way to explain it. But
I get what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's basically not that versus
Detections.
Detection,
Yeah.
the laboratory can see presence.
yes.
Well, I think OU4 plume shows dots where it was non-detect. If you wanted to show like OU4 plume,
Yes.
it shows where they've dotted around and done sampling around.
But that was like historical, so that's.
Yeah,
not
it was
current.
historical. It's, but you can see like there's
Yeah.
dots outside, so they've kind of defined,
Yeah.
there's
This is
dots
better.
that don't have anything.
Yeah, this is a better demonstration of it. So yeah, you typically have like investigate with a bunch of points, and then we'll bound the plume based on non-detects and detections.
But there was one slide that showed, here's the plume, now you see me in 2014, and then in 2021, there was the now we got it. Completely gone. I'm not sure which slide that
That was a
was.
flume reduction map, vinyl chloride slide.
So yeah,
Now you
this,
see me, now you don't.
yeah, this particular slide, as you can see, and I don't have on this particular slide, you can see different shades of green, right? So I don't have what those are on there, but the darker the green color, the higher the concentration was. So when you go out towards the lighter color of the plume, obviously that concentration would be lower. And again, I apologize, I don't have what those numbers are on here. But yes, over time, the plume would have pulled back, right? So again, as I had pointed out, you can see just barely the tip of the green on this figure from 2021. And sorry for those who can't see on the phone or on the Zoom, this is the boundary of the substation. We use the word substation here. So again, in 2021, now again, keep in mind, this is based on existing monitoring wells that were in place at the time, right? This was the extent. We were no longer seeing the plume through here like we did back in 2014.
Could you, knowing that slide right there, showing those in 2014, 2021, could you move forward to another slide you had where you had a bunch of green and yellow and red dots?
Okay. Oh. Green, was that on, do you remember which operable unit that
probably
was?
the next one.
Just recent detection.
Right
This one? Okay.
There.
See now, pardon my ignorance here, but that's a lot farther out than that small green dot inside of.
Yes. Yes. So if you could,
What's changed here?
so you see the green dots that are on here, those are still non-detect, right? So those are still within that plume that we were just talking about that's no longer there, right? So the locations that you're seeing in red, there were not monitoring wells there from that 2000. Yeah. So what you see there are not monitoring wells. Those red dots are the investigation we did with a technology called direct push technology, where we went in and took samples in real time. And that was the result. So you can see that where those barrier walls, here's where the historical treatment happened in this section here. These are the two barrier walls that were put in place. So that green plume that was on the other side was right here. It's still not there. It's moved to the east. So
Okay.
now, and again, there's obviously a water body here, so we don't have monitoring wells in this location. So what we're doing as part of the site characterization plan is that there are going to be some more samples taken here to see what we're thinking is going on right now. Is that it's scooting still from here, and it's scooting right up this edge and hitting right there, and then on up towards the top in that red box is where City Well 6 and Piezometer 11 are. So again, it's kind of bypassed this remediation on the eastern side.
This may not be the right way to say it, but the plume did not go away. It just moved.
Yeah, it's hard to know at this point whether it just completely shifted or if it came back and went that way, right? We don't know.
Because if you look at those first two, the 21, like 14 and 21, it looks like things just went away.
Right.
But in fact, they didn't.
Well, again, we don't know if it went back and moved after that or if it just completely moved and it never really went all the way back, right? Those figures, I don't remember which direction it was now. Yeah, we don't know, right? Because we didn't have monitoring wells here. which was an oversight on our part, right? If we would have had monitoring wells here to start with, we would be able to answer that question. Unfortunately, we don't have any there.
But if you don't have a test anywhere, then you can't detect it.
Right, exactly. Which is why they're going back out now to test to see if we're going to get hits here in the boundary of this water body. And if we do, that would give us a better indication, right, that that is the path that it's traveling up to that corner.
What about the site boundaries? So are those being established? I don't think they've ever
As
been
far as
established.
the, under the site characterization plan, that's work that's in that plan, right, is to make sure that we have an insurance extent
Of the whole site?
of OU4.
Okay.
Yeah, again,
So how far out are they testing?
I don't want to get into too many specifics because we're still working. I don't want to say something that changes, right? So, I mean, there's a, trying to see if this one is bigger. There is a location that is kind of closer to City Well 7 that would be north of City Well 6, where they're going to, right now, again, this is what's proposed right now, which is why I don't want to get too much into what may change.
But has the contamination been detected north of City Hall 7? So why are we not testing further north?
So there was contamination in monitoring well 17 S and D, which was a monitoring well put in by Ameren. It's not on here, but it is a northern monitoring well. So we do know that there's something in that well. We have some indication of what's maybe out there based on city wells, keeping in mind that city wells are deeper, right, than what we're typically looking at here at the 45-foot level, the 65-foot level. So yeah, again, we're looking at make sure that we have a better idea of the eastern side in particular of where the plume is, and then also making sure we have a good feel for what's going on to the north.
So if you know that these contaminants go down, they say, we got back from the chemistry and
Right.
everything, why are we only going 45 to 60 feet down when we know the city wells are 100 feet?
That's one of the things, right, in the site characterization plan that was pointed out was, do we have good vertical delineation? Now, based on the historical, there's too many buttons up here to remember where I'm. Again, based on this, and this is, again, was done back in 2010, 2011, right? Those black dots that you see were done at multiple depths. So there's, 84 different locations where they did multiple depths. And almost all of them, with the exception of, I think maybe of 4 locations, I may be wrong on that, it was all, the detections were all in that 45-ish foot range. So that is, oh, now it's not working for me, Jess. Not just your finger. And then when we went out, EPA, I think it's a little over a year ago now. I can't remember exactly when we went out. I want to say it was January of last year. Again, these red dots that you see, when we did that DPT work, we again went in and did multiple depths, right? We just don't go in and take one. So we would look at 45, 55, 65. I can't remember the exact depths off the top of my head. And what we found again was that the vast majority of what we were seeing was in that 45 to 65 foot range. That is just where the conduit, that's where the water is moving at the best conduit, for lack of a better word, for where the water is moving. And that's where we're seeing that mass at. That doesn't mean there's not anything deeper. Doesn't mean there's not anything shallower, but that is obviously the target zone that we want to get to, because that's where we're going to have the most impact with what we're doing.
I think the GP that mentioned there were different factors that could influence what was happening, how fast it moved, flooding, drought, and pumping wells,
Right.
Intakes to wells, because that is pulling on the groundwater,
Right.
To bring it into those pumps.
And to clarify, right now you're not sure if this is the old plume that shifted east or this is a new plume, right? Is that correct? What you're trying to say?
I mean, I think we can safely say it's the same plume. It's just whether or not it retracted and went back, or whether it just completely shifted is somewhat of an unknown. And we can't recreate that because we didn't have wells in the right place to be able to answer
So
that
can we
question.
take a moment and make sure there's like maybe not a question online?
I don't know how to check that. So
Just to give them an opportunity to be part of this?
So what are the wells that are being placed now to make sure that the plume doesn't shift?
differently.
So let me get back in front of the microphone.
Hey, Kellen, can you check to see if there are any?
Yeah, we don't have any questions on
Thank you.
Thank you. You got a question back there?
Oh, well, I was going to answer Kara's question first. If I remember the question. Oh, so yes, right. We want to make sure moving forward, because there is a vast different number of ways the city could pump their wells in the future, right? Different combinations, different ways, whether they pump stuff to the north or to the east or to the south, right? There's a different combination of things that can happen. So the site characterization plan, the intent of that document is to understand where nature and extent is at this point in time, right? So what we usually do where that comes into play will probably be under what we call the remedial design, which would be after the ROD amendment or the ESD or whatever happens. So when that remedy is selected, then we will go back and make sure that we have wells or whatever is needed in place as part of that design, right? So once you get the remedy in place, you want to make sure it's going to operate correctly now and in the future. So at that point, you want to make sure you have wells in place, even if you expect them to be non-detect, you want to put them in place that they're going to catch something before it has an opportunity to potentially impact the city well. So that will not be under the site characterization plan, but it will be under the remedial design. I can't project a timeline. It would be, so the way where's the step out? I don't know if it's on that.
It stopped with the feasibility study.
Did it? So the record of decision amendment or explanation of significant differences, that's what we're striving for right now. After that, it's not on this figure. So remedial design would be after the record of decision, but before remedial action. So the remedial design basically is what it says, right? It's designing what that remedial action would look like to make sure, again, that we have wells in place to be able to make sure that that system has everything it needs to be able to function and remain protected.
Okay, so we need to move back to the question on the way in the back.
Yeah, to piggyback on her question about vertical delineation, that data that you were talking about from 2010, you said the focus area was at 45 feet, right? And that was based on their previous data. Do you know how deep that data went?
Which data are we talking?
So you were talking about that they took samples from various depths or several.
Oh, how deep the deepest ones went at that time?
Yeah.
I want to say with a caveat here that I might be off a little bit. Unless JP knows for sure, I want to say they went down 85 to 95 foot. But again, I want to caveat that with I don't have the numbers in front of me. But it was deep. It was not.
I was just curious if they had gone.
Yeah, it's kind of back to my original question about delineating what the edge of that plume is. The current draft revised site characterization plan defined it as being above or below MCL by determining the step out location as well. So that's not.
Yeah. So
what's the leading edge?
Yeah. So the site characterization plan, and again, I'm going to caveat again, I'm going to use that word somewhat until we have documents finalized. I'm always a little hesitant to say what they're going to end up being, but so the site characterization plan, we've identified locations where we want to make sure that we do not have contamination to the east or to the north beyond where we think it currently sits, right? So we have an idea of where we think it is, but we want to confirm that with these wells to kind of go around the boundary. So the ideal is that those are going to be non-detect. These locations that are proposed in that site characterization plan, for those who've looked at the draft, we're not expecting to see anything in those wells. If we do, the way it's written is Ameren needs to step out until they find a well that is non-detect so that we have a good idea of where that boundary is. So what you're saying, John, is, well, they're saying
that once they get below MCL, but still have detection that is the edge.
Yeah, and that's a continued conversation with Ameren, right? We're going to be looking at the data as it comes in. This data that Ameren's going to be doing, they're going to have on like a 24-hour lab turnaround. So we're going to be seeing this data in real time. And if EPA decides that they need to step out, they're still going to be in the field, they're going to step out. Yep, Monty.
As somebody who takes lots of calls from people that everybody gets on the internet, takes a look at EPA Superfund guidance and talks about remedial investigations. think there's some confusion as to why work to characterize the site is being done now, when most people think that it, from the articles they've read, it should be done in the remedial investigation. The characterization site. Can you talk about that, Tanya? Like why is this happening now as opposed to?
Right. So it kind of goes back to what I mentioned in the presentation, right? We had moved forward with a record of decision, and then that well popped up, that location. Okay.
But the record of decision comes long after the.
Yes. So the remedial investigation and the original feasibility study were completed. This was before my time on the site, but I believe the remedial investigation, I want to say, was done in 2020. The ROD was done in 2021, June of 2021. This detection that you see showed up in December of 2021. So we were moving forward with the consent decree and trying to move into that remedial design phase when this showed up. None of us were expecting this, right? This caught us off guard. I mean, we'll be frank about that, right? We were not expecting it. We couldn't figure out where it came from. And that's when we went out and did the investigation. The fact that we could not account for what happened there caused us to go back to Ameren and say, you guys need to relook at this and kind of reopen the RI. So you'll see on this figure here, what we've called a what did we end up calling it? A supplemental remedial investigation report. That is something that we've come up with and told Ameren that after they do this work under the site characterization plan, that they need to go back since the original RI was completed and sum up all that we've learned since then, all the data, all the information we've obtained, including information that the city has gotten from putting in their own monitoring wells, and relook at this and basically submit a supplemental to that remedial investigation that will feed that new focused feasibility study. So we're going somewhat backwards, not to redo everything, but to specifically focus in on what this change is and how they account for that change, what happened, and how they're going to address that change, because that could obviously impact the remedy that was laid out in 2021.
I think it's confusing to people when you look at the OU1, OU2, the timing is old, and the fact that the site wasn't fully characterized, and that there's an RI and an FS for each one of the couple of units. It's all very confusing. I'm not complaining. I'm not even telling you how to fix it. I'm just stating sort of the
Right. I think, we're aware that our process is not always easy to follow. I mean, I've been with EPA Superfund for 25 years now, and I still sometimes get like, what, it's complicated, right? There's a lot of steps, there's a lot of process with our process, and it can get confusing. The way we break sites out can be confusing. It varies from site to site. And there's lots of different reasons why we do it that way or certain ways. And yes, we recognize it can be confusing, which is why we like to have these types of meetings, right? So we can try to help people understand and not get hung up on the terminology, just kind of try to get the concept across and what we're trying to get to. Because we recognize our terminology and bureaucracy, right, can be hard for some people to follow.
I have a question. Based on what I've heard today, at the beginning, you weren't sure if operating unit 4 was like part of 1, 2, or 3, because 3 was created from groundwater that flowed from operating units 1 and 2, right? So at the time, you weren't sure if 4 was part of the other 3. So do we know for sure today that operating unit 4 is actually not directly connected to 1, 2, and 3? They're just in the same geographic area. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes. So
Okay.
yeah, so we didn't know that there was an issue with 4, right? There was a hit of the same types of contaminants. Again, in this city well right here, city well 5. And I know it's not on here, so it's kind of separated. So OU1 and 2 and 3 would be down here somewhere. So it was like, wait, kind of the same thing that happened on 4, right? When we saw that thing that happened in 2021, did we miss something? Instead of the plume being here, is it now going here? So there was an assumption that might be contamination from that OU3 plume.
So that's why this is grouped with the Findett Superfund site, because at the time you opened the investigation, the assumption was this was part of that contamination, but now we know this is actually a separate thing.
The assumption was it could have been part of that contamination, right? And it was clear, again, you can just follow the colors, right? It's very clear when they did their investigation, it led straight to the Houston Road substation. So at that point, Ameren would come on board, and then of course they investigated within that substation and found the source area of that material where it was much, much higher than what we were seeing off the property. So it clearly identified a separate, distinct source of contamination from that OU1, OU2. It just so happened that they were the same VOCs, but I think it's important to keep in mind when we're talking about tetrachloroethylene or trichloroethylene, the vast majority of the sites that we work on in Superfund include these contaminants. They were widely used pretty much everywhere in the United States back in the 60s and 70s before there were regulations to control them, right? So again, I've been with EPA for a long time. I would say 95% of the sites I've worked on have been these particular contaminants in groundwater.
So before I drop this, so basically, what we're here for is just for operating unit 4. You mentioned 1, 2, and 3 as background to explain why this is called the Findett Super Site, because at the time you thought this was part of that contamination. But actually, may I suggest for future presentations, you mentioned that operating unit 4 is actually a different plume from 1, 2, and 3. That would clarify a lot of things.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it, but we can certainly clarify that, right? Because I know there's a lot that we're pushing out a lot of information at once and you might not catch it all. Yeah. So, but I think, you know, this meeting wasn't just for OU4, right? I think we've talked about OU4 a couple of times with the community. And as far as I know, we've not had any presentations in a long time, probably decades, right? On 1, 2, and 3. So we wanted to make sure as we're moving forward, since we have an engaged, interested community, that we're also letting you know what's going on 1, 2, and 3, because we're actively relooking at 1 and 3 at this point too. And you're going to see some more movement on those sites moving forward as well.
Question. You said that a lot of the sites across the U.S. that are Superfund have these same volatile compounds. Are they typically tied to electrical substations? I mean, in my mind, there's a big difference between a manufacturing plant like a Findett and a Cadmus that are bringing in many, many, many thousands of gallons and barrels and of waste and cleaning it versus a substation. I don't get the same magnitude of chemicals in my head from a substation versus a manufacturing site.
And again, I can speak to my experience. I certainly can't speak to what other regions, what the percentages are. I have one other substation that I have worked on in Region 7, which includes Iowa, Nebraska, Missouri, and Kansas, where there was these contaminants associated with the substation. But most of where we see this stuff is not what you would picture when like what you mentioned, right? When you see these big chemical facilities, a lot of times it's small facilities, right? It takes very little of this contamination to have a problem. Kind of an analogy that someone used with me a long time ago was if you take one of those great big city water tanks that you see when you drive around, those big tanks, if you poured a 12-ounce soda in that tank, you would contaminate that above the MCL for TCE. I mean, it takes very little. Kind of going back to that parts per million, right? To kind of go back to that concept, if you think of 1 in a million, it doesn't take much to get above it. So a lot of times we'll see it even at a mom and pop auto repair, because a lot of times it was used as a metal degreaser, right? So if you take it and you clean your carburetors, whatever you did, right, you would find it. Another place that we see it typically is at dry cleaners. A lot of dry cleaners use PCE, the tetrachloroethylene. So you'll see it a lot as part of that dry cleaning process, that kind of that odor. Even like now, if you go pick up your clothes from the dry cleaner, it's not PCE, I don't think anymore, but that odor that you used to smell, that's the PCE.
You had a question all the way back on the top row.
I'm just curious, so OU4, has Ameren been named as a PRP or they've been named as a responsible party?
They are, so they're a PRP, that's a terminology we use, but they are the party that is responsible for cleaning up this contamination. It's a little bit of semantics, but it's legal semantics, so but we've determined that they are the responsible party that needs to clean this up, but we call them potentially responsible parties. It's a legal thing.
So they're potentially responsible for contamination, but they are responsible.
EPA has deemed them responsible.
Okay. So the timeline of getting this cleanup taken care of, is Ameren hitting the deadlines that are set forth by the EPA?
For the most part, yeah, like I said, this last deadline that we gave them back in December. And again, I can't talk about the historical staff. I've only been on the site for a little less than 2 years. This was the timeline that we gave them. Like I said, the next thing you'll see on here that says 119 for the site characterization plan finalization. This is the third and fourth line down. And the PMP finalization, those were due tomorrow. Again, I think we're gonna
get those next week.
I think we're finalizing. I actually have the plans back. They came, or the site characterization plan came in last night. Obviously, we were traveling here. I've not looked at it. So what happened? They submitted the draft. We reviewed that draft. We provided them comments. They've resubmitted that draft, and that is sitting in my inbox right now to look at. But I'm probably not going to get a chance to review it before Friday because we thought it was important to come here and talk.
If we're at step 3 and they're already missing deadlines, what happens when we get to step 5, 6, 7?
Right.
At this point, if as a resident who's drinking this water and paying taxes in the city of St. Charles, that they have to think about buy water from the city of St. Louis, or we're installing this GAC system, who's putting the bill for that? And if Ameren is delaying us getting our water clean or getting this plume cleaned up so we don't have to purchase much water, or we're not using much of that carbon in the GAC system, where is the recourse to Ameren?
Yeah, you know, I can only speak to my interactions with Ameren, right? I have not seen what I would determine any intentional delaying on Ameren's part. All my interactions with them, they seem to be, you know, probably moving too fast, which we rarely say, right? Because we're very slow in the way we do things. But I have not seen anything where it felt like they were dragging their feet or trying to push this out. Like I mentioned before, our process can be exhausting sometimes because it's so long. If there, let's say the site characterization plan that they submitted, if we wouldn't have had any comments on it, we would have been golden with this timeline, right? But we did have substantial comments on that report, which caused them to do substantial revisions. If this document that they resubmitted last night is in good shape, we should be able to finalize that really quickly early next week. If I have to make additional substantial comments, it may take a little longer, right? So a lot of this is just making sure the documents are comprehensive and that they accomplish everything they need to accomplish. And the more we have to go back and forth with the documents, the longer it can take. But they're not, it's not like they're missing and they're not submitting the documents when they're supposed to. It's more that back and forth conversation. And yeah.
Well, the other thing she did mention during the presentation was that there can be delays. I mean, if drill rigs aren't available or the weather is really bad and they can't get out there, we don't want those delays, but you know, we can't fault Mother Nature if that happens, or the lack of the ability to do
I understand that, but I work for a general contractor. I work around drill rigs on a regular basis, and I'm held to the standards by my clients. If I miss a date, then I work overtime, and I work additional hours, and I give additional crews. And I go get a drill rig from Texas or from Arizona to make up the drill rig that they don't have here. But we can make excuses all day long, but at the end of the day, they're not the ones that are paying the bill for this. They're not the ones that are dealing with, you know, having 2 small children or wife at home. They're concerned. Is it okay that we drink the water? Is it okay that we bathe in it, that we shower, we wash our clothes in it? So.
Well, something to remember is the water is safe to bathe in and drink it. The water coming out of the city's plant is.
And I trust the city that it is, but at what point, you know, do we just continue this forever? We have to have some sort of end.
To what point,
Who pays the bill? I mean, what did that GAC system cost the city of St. Charles to put in that garbage system?
Isn't there a lawsuit between the city and Ameren, or has that been? I haven't been able to find any information about that. Is that still ongoing?
There is a lawsuit or litigation between the city and Ameren. EPA is not involved in that litigation. We do not let the litigation influence our path forward and what we're doing. We're obviously aware of it and any complications that may arise from that. But again, we're focused on what we're doing as we would on any other site.
So is anyone here actually from the city?
Yeah.
Okay, we have one at least.
Yeah, the litigation is completely independent of the Superfund and settlement process. It is a state court claim that is regarding property rights. About all I can speak on since it's an ongoing lawsuit.
All right, we are at 7:30. So we're going to transition to the CAG working session. If you all have additional questions that didn't get answered, anyone online, feel free to reach out to me directly. The handouts in the back have the site profile page and my contact information on it. So feel free to contact me anytime via phone or email, but I'll kind of turn it over to the CAG. Yeah, we can end the recording here since it'll be a CAG, if that's okay with everybody on the CAG, to go ahead and end the recording and just kind of work internally here in the room with the CAG working session. Sound good, Kara? Gary? All right, well, perfect. Thanks for everyone online who joined us. We're going to move into the CAG working session. I appreciate everyone taking the time. Thank you.